Fantastic. We'll go ahead and kick things off. Really excited to introduce the Healthie community to this webinar. This has been many months in the works, and our goal here at Healthie is to help educate our network and community about latest advances in technology and science, vitamins, supplements, DNA testing, and everything in between. Really an interesting topic in which the science is definitely still emerging, but Healthie's perspective is that it's really important for our community to be aware and at the forefront of everything that is happening in the industry. So with that, we are really excited to turn it over today to Dr. Daniel Wallerstorfer, who's going to be talking about the industry today and how he sees it with regards to personal nutrient supplementation. Dr. Daniel is a leading expert in the field of genetics, biotechnology, and nutrigenetics. He acts as a scientific advisor to a number of large institutions, speaks throughout Europe and the US on a variety of topics, and is also a serial entrepreneur himself. He's built several companies in genetics and nutrition, including one of Europe's leading prevention and lifestyle-based genetic and nutrient labs, and a personalized micronutrient and supplement production facility, as well as a software company that specializes in the use of AI in genomic interpretation. He holds a PhD in biotechnology and a BSc in molecular biology from the University of Manchester, which is one of Europe's top universities. And as we go through the presentation, our hope is that we spark a genuine and possibly controversial discussion on the topic of personalized nutrition supplements, knowing, of course, that there are a lot of different perspectives on the industry. There are limitations to what science can do, and it's definitely an emerging field. So we are not going to be advocating for a one-size-fits-all here, nor this is the absolute best way to do it, but our goal is to spread awareness in this emerging field. And we're really, really excited to host a discussion and be a part of this conversation. So with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Daniel.
Okay, thank you very much for this introduction. So I hope you can see my screen. Can you see the presentation screen? Just to make sure.
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. Good. So as Erica has said, if you have any questions, use the chat function. But at the end, I will also give you my email address so you can get in touch with me. As I have been introduced, I'm a molecular biologist with a very strong focus on the field of epigenetics. And I hold a PhD in biotechnology, but I'm also the founder and CEO of a company called Nutrigenetics, which has become, over the last 10 years, Europe's leading nutrigenetic laboratory. So we do nutrigenetic testing. So just for transparency, I am going to be a little bit biased because I have been developing nutrigenetic testing for the last 10 years, as well as personalized supplementation strategies and technologies. But my aim is to give you a broad overview of where the science is today, what the principles are of personalization, and what the advantages and disadvantages of certain delivery methods are. Okay, I'm going to start with a very bold statement of which I believe to be true from my last 10 years of experience. And that is, if you take 20 different nutrients, and those might be vitamins, minerals, trace elements, statistically, one of them is likely to harm you. 2 are going to have no effect, and the rest are going to be at the wrong dose. Now, I know a lot of you are health professionals and you have nutritional training, so feel free to disagree. However, I want to spend the next 20 minutes or so to give you a little insight of how I came to this conclusion. So when we talk about personalization, the principle is quite straightforward. We take personal information, we use that in a certain way to come to a certain outcome. And depending on what information we use, whatever that may be, we come to a different outcome. So the most straightforward way of personalization is lifestyle. So obviously the kind of things that I eat, how much exercise I do, how much I go out into the sun, all of this has a certain impact on how my body uses nutrients and so on. So for example, there's quite a strong link with a lack of sunlight. So when people don't go out into the sun and the UV rays don't get the chance to touch the skin, so the body cannot produce vitamin D3. So people who do not go out into the sun have a higher likelihood of being vitamin D deficient. Other aspects such as avoiding dairy could lead to a lower calcium intake. If you're vegan or vegetarian, you're more prone to become vitamin B12 deficient. And if you generally don't eat enough fruits and vegetables, you're likely to be deficient in certain vitamins. Now, this is probably the easiest way of personalizing, because you essentially do a questionnaire. However, it's probably also the least scientific. So there is a link, but just because a person doesn't go out into the sun doesn't necessarily mean that they're very deficient. So there is some merit in using this kind of information for recommendations. However, yeah, as a scientist, there are better ways. Certainly, it does make sense to consider it, but there are other aspects of personalization that need to be considered. So lifestyle is the first one. So just doing a questionnaire, finding out what the person's needs are. The next one are blood levels. This is a quite common approach. So doctors or nutritionists would do this. They do a blood test and just check if the nutrients are within the norm. And the general way of approaching this is, if there's a deficiency, you make sure that the intake is increased. So you would eat more of a certain nutrient through changing the diet, or you could supplement with that substance. And then the other approach is, if the level is normal, so within normal ranges, you would find it to be okay. And generally, doctors or nutritionists would usually say, okay, no action needed. So essentially, blood levels are a good way of finding out if you have deficiencies. However, from genetics, we find that this is not necessarily absolutely true. So I want to look into one further level of personalization, where maybe having a normal level of certain nutrient in the blood is still not sufficient. So we're going to look into the genetic blueprint, which essentially contains a lot of information of what kind of nutrients my body actually needs, what it is able to metabolize, and even what kind of nutrients could be harmful. So those are the three main areas that are being used for personalization by various companies. Now, genetics is my main field, so I'm going to mostly talk about genetics. For anyone who can't remember their biology lesson, a very quick recap. So the human body consists of around 50 billion individual cells, and almost every cell has a nucleus, and those contain chromosomes, so these X shapes that we all know from television. And if you look at a chromosome in more detail, you find that it's a very tightly wound thread. And this thread is the DNA double helix, this winding ladder. And in there, you will find the genetic code, and that only consists of 4 different genetic letters, so A, T, G, and C. And by only using different combinations of these letters, biology or nature is able to build the whole recipe for a human body. And now, if we talk about genes are certain regions in this genetic code. So, for example, an enzyme gene would mean that this genetic code in this area here contains the instructions for the body to tell it how to, for example, digest lactose, so sugar that is present in milk. Now, that brings me on to another thing. So a lot of scientists, a lot of clinicians agree that nutrigenetics is something of the future. So in the future, we're going to know what kind of food is good for us, bad for us. We are at least going to have the option of eating according to our genes. Now, before we dive into the supplements, I just want to put a question mark on this. Is this really a thing of the future? And for this, I want to go back 20,000 years. At that time, all humans were still in Africa and Europe. And at that time, we all were hunters and gatherers. Essentially, that meant we went out with bow and arrow and we hunted deer. Mammoths were already extinct by then. So we were hunting for food and gathering plants and so on. And a baby used to have access to breast milk. So this is a standard caveman baby, and breast milk does contain lactose. And lactose is essentially a big molecule. It consists of two smaller sugars which are attached to each other. And lactose itself, if it goes into the intestine, and this is supposed to show you the intestine, it's too large to be absorbed into the bloodstream. So for the baby to be able to digest it, we first need a certain gene called the lactase gene, which tells the body how to build an enzyme, a small molecular scissors that splits lactose into the smaller sugars, glucose and galactose. And those are small enough molecules that they can be absorbed. So every baby needs this gene to be able to tolerate lactose and digest it, and then it's a very good food source. If this baby then grew up in Stone Age time, there was no more access to milk because no supermarket, no cows around. So essentially nature said, well, why should we then waste the energy of building this enzyme? It's important to conserve energy. So evolution gave us an element, a genetic element that turned off this gene with increasing age of the person. So the older this caveman got, the more the gene turned off and no more enzyme was produced. In the Stone Age, no problem, because there was no lactose anyway. So this conserved energy. If you now had a time machine and traveled back to this person and gave him a carton of milk from the supermarket, he might think it could be a good idea to drink this milk. So what would happen is lactose ends up in his intestine. There's no enzyme that digests it. And then bacteria think, hey, great, that's a very good source of energy. And bacteria would start to metabolize lactose into gases and acids and cause very severe digestive problems. And this is what we today call lactose intolerance. So actually this caveman is a person who's lactose intolerant. So he would not thank you for giving him the carton of milk because it made him very ill. So the normal ancient programming that we have in our genes is to produce a lot of this lactase enzyme at birth, and then because we need it, and then the production shuts down. And this is progressive. It could be quite fast. In some people, it happens at the age of 6. In some, it takes up to 80 years. But generally, what happens is that the production goes down, and if you keep eating dairy products or drinking milk, you become more and more lactose intolerant. So this is the normal ancient programming. And then around 7,500 years ago, something new happened. By that time, we had domesticated animals. So we suddenly had access to milk as grown-ups. However, remember, we were still lactose intolerant, so nobody was drinking the milk at that time. And then a genetic mutation happened. So it's essentially an error. The gene itself was changed, so one of the genetic letters has changed in one person. And what happened is not the gene was destroyed, but the switching off mechanism was destroyed through this error. So what happened in this grown-up is suddenly he was producing the enzyme just like a newborn baby. And he was the first person who was able to tolerate lactose in that way. And if he now had access, if he now did drink the milk from the domesticated animals, he could digest it just like a baby. So he didn't have any bad symptoms. And so just like a baby, he kept producing the enzyme. Now, 5 out of 6 people in Europe now have this mutation. So it's a lot more common than the ancestral type. So why is this? Why is this new mutation so common? And people think the following happened. We know that this was a very tough time. So a lot of people starved to death. And it is thought that this one person had one advantage. He had one extra source of food. So he could drink milk and eat dairy. And he was able to eat this food, and also his children inherited this mutation. And now we know that around 80% of Caucasian Europeans are direct descendants from this one person. This happens somewhere in the region of Sweden. We know that because Sweden has the highest level of lactose tolerance, so the new mutation, and the further you go down south in Europe, the more rare it comes. So this happened in Europe, and since Europeans were quite aggressive in traveling and colonizing the world, they brought this genetic mutation to the rest of the world. But in Africa and Asia, still almost 100% are lactose intolerant. So this is a little bit a little bit of human evolution that happened there. So the question is nutrigenetics, eating according to our genes, really something of the future? And I think I could have showed you that this is something that is as old as humanity. So this is a very clear way. So you drink milk, you feel bad. This is a quite fast way of detecting that your genes are not compatible with your food. With modern technologies, we can now go a lot deeper. And this is a curve of the publication. So some of you might have heard of the database called PubMed. So essentially all scientific publications on PubMed, all scientific publications on life sciences are published on PubMed. So there are around 26 million publications to date, and around 3.5 million are already on the topic of genetics, and around 5,000 are on the field of nutrigenetics or gene-diet interactions. And this is something that is growing exponentially. So we do learn a lot, and we already have a lot of information about genetic effects with diseases as well as nutrition. And this area of gene-diet interactions and nutrigenetics is something that is of particular interest to me and hopefully you. So what can we do with this information? You all have seen this before. And this is the food pyramid, and it's a very honest and very well-intentioned instruction of how to eat healthy. So essentially, fats and sweets only occasionally in small amounts, dairy products 3 servings per day, gluten-containing products, so cereal products several times per day. And the more we learn about genetics, the more we see that there are exceptions. So for example, 3 servings of dairy products a day is a good source of calcium, is a good idea, but not for those around 10%, 20%, depending on the population, that are lactose intolerant. So they should eat lactose-free dairy products or other sources of calcium. So that's the first exception. Next one, cereal products several times per day. Not for those who are genetically gluten intolerant or have celiac disease. So there's another exception. And then red meat is a good source of iron. That's true for some people with iron deficiency. However, certain genes lead to an excessive iron uptake, and that can cause a disease called hemochromatosis, so iron overload disorder. So those people should not eat iron-containing foods and actually eat less of that. So by just looking at 4 different genes, in this example, we already found 3 exceptions to the rule of normal nutrition. And the reality is, the more we look into nutrigenetics, the more we find that in reality, nobody fits into this standard recommendation anymore. This is an overview of all of the genes that currently, in our opinion, or my opinion, have reached a certain level of scientific credibility where they interact with certain nutrients. So this is a panel of nutrigenetic genes, and they do influence things like heart health, oxidative stress, cognitive health, bone health, and so on. There are a lot of good stories about all of them. However, we don't have time. I'm just going to pick out a few genes and show you how they actually influence our nutrient need. The probably best known gene in the field of nutrigenetics is the gene MTHFR. And this is what happens. So folic acid is a quite common nutritional supplement. It's also fortified in foods because generally the general public agrees it's important you have enough folic acid, especially during pregnancy. I think almost every woman who is pregnant is supplementing with folic acid. So it is an important molecule that has a lot of healthy functions. The problem is that folic acid itself is not active in the body. So if I eat it through supplements or nutrients or fortified foods, it's still inactive in our body. But that's not a problem because there's a gene called the MTHFR gene, which has the function to convert the inactive folic acid to the active form called 5-MTHF. So folic acid needs a gene to be converted to be healthy. Now, some people do have two mutated versions of this gene, and you can see this number here. So it's 9% of the population have very ineffective versions of this gene. So what happens is they ingest folic acid, it remains inactive, it cannot be activated, and folic acid remains without effect. So what can you do if you have this genetic variation? Folic acid obviously is not the solution. However, there's the active form that you can already supplement with. Certain foods have it, but it's quite unstable when you cook it. So supplementation is a quite effective way of how to make sure you do get enough of this. So if you already supplement with the active form, you still get the health effect. So depending on your status of the MTHFR gene, there are different recommendations of what nutrients or what supplementation you should be following. Now, I do need to talk about science a little bit, so you know it exists. So this has been studied quite well. So in 2014, there was a meta-study, so one study that consists of many different studies that studied 227,000 people, and they found the following. If you have a mutated MTHFR gene, so a broken MTHFR gene, folic acid remains inactive, and this leads to folate deficiency, or at least a very high likelihood of folate deficiency. And this has been shown in this meta-study. Clerk has shown the same in 23,000 people, Holmes in 60,000 people, Casas in 13,000 people, and so on. And last time I checked, I found 297 peer-reviewed studies on PubMed, all independent studies that have looked at in total more than 300,000 subjects and have shown this link. So if you have a mutated gene, folic acid is not going to work and you're likely to be folate deficient. Then you might ask for the gold standard in studies, and that for supplements is a placebo-controlled study. Essentially what happens is you either get the nutrient or you get a tic-tac, so something that doesn't contain it, and then you look at the difference. So this makes sure you don't have any bias by the scientist that is doing this. And in 2018, a quite big study of 2,300 people was published that showed that if you have normal versions of the MTHFR gene, folic acid can be converted. Also, the 5-MTHF is functional, of course, because folic acid is converted into it. And vitamin B2 doesn't have any effect on folate metabolism. However, if you have the genetic mutation, so the genetic variation, folic acid is not functional. So you need to supplement with the active form, and suddenly vitamin B2 is also beneficial. So quite interesting what they have shown. And then Wilson has shown the same in a placebo study, McNulty has shown it, and so on. In total, we have 11 placebo studies on PubMed studying more than 6,300 different subjects. So this was one gene, and I think I could show that there is people do react differently to folic acid, and choosing the right type of folate is dependent on the function of the MTHFR gene, which we can detect through a genetic test. Another good example is the NQO1 gene. So coenzyme Q10 is a great substance. Essentially, our body produces it itself, but it's also available as a supplement, and a lot of beauty creams use it. And one of the reasons is, while coenzyme Q10 doesn't actually have an effect in the body itself, again, there is a gene called NQO1, which converts it into the active form called ubiquinol. And this is then a strong antioxidant. So this means it neutralizes waste products from our metabolism that would otherwise cause a lot of damage and are one of the main causes of aging. So it's an important process, and this is also why the body does produce it itself, even though production goes down with increasing age. So it's a great molecule. The problem is that some people, 6% of the population, have broken versions of this gene. So what happens is you supplement with Q10. If you now did a blood test, and remember before I said, is this true? Having normal amounts, is this sufficient? if you did a blood test, you would say high levels of Q10, everything's fine. The reality is it's not functional. So you really need genetic data to find out, is this the right molecule, the right substance to use to reach my goal? And in this case, no, it is not. So what can you do? You can either supplement with the already active form, or you can supplement or increase your intake through diet of other substances that have a similar function. And those are vitamin C, vitamin E, alpha lipoic acid, and so on. So again, depending on the genetics, Q10 might be a good product or a good substance to use, or you might use other antioxidants at a higher dose to reach the same goal. And another example, vitamin D receptor. Vitamin D is produced by the skin. So if you go out into the sunlight, your body starts producing vitamin D. However, it needs a way of measuring if there is enough vitamin D. Now, in a very simplified way, you can imagine it like this. The gene, the vitamin D receptor gene, makes these green arms, and these sit on the surface of cells. And vitamin D has the right shape to dock onto these receptors. And when this happens, the receptor sends a signal to the cell and essentially says, okay, we've got enough vitamin D, do something healthy. So having deficiency in vitamin D, so too low levels, is bad, because then this healthy effect doesn't happen. So far so good, but some people have a genetic variation in this gene. So this green arm thing is not built in the right way. It can still recognize vitamin D and still send the signal, but it's a lot less efficient. So what scientists have found, even normal amounts of vitamin D do not create a strong enough signal to create the healthy effects of vitamin D. And what other studies have found is if you then increase the amount of vitamin D to a higher level, you activate enough of these less effective receptors to get the same result. So depending on your genetics, a normal amount, this on the right-hand side, a normal amount of vitamin D might be sufficient. Or if you have a genetic variation, then you might need higher amounts. So you shouldn't be in the norm, you should be on the top range, top level of the norm to make sure you are not deficient in vitamin D. Next example, GPX1. It's also an interesting gene. So the GPX1 gene contains the instructions of how to build the GPX1 protein. And this is a so-called selenoprotein, which means it needs the trace element selenium from diet. So selenium is integrated into this enzyme, and then it has a function. And then again, it recognizes certain free radicals, so toxic molecules that our body produces that need to be removed before they do any damage. So with selenium, you produce this, and then the free radical comes along and is broken into smaller pieces. And so if you are selenium deficient, this doesn't happen, so you should have enough selenium. Now, there are some people, again, which have a genetic error in this gene, genetic variation. And what happens is the instructions of how it is built are slightly different. So you see this red thing here. It still needs selenium to be built, and it still recognizes free radicals, but the efficiency of this process is a lot lower. So even with a normal amount of selenium, you end up with a lower protection against these free radicals through this genetic error that you have inherited. So you only have low activity even though you're not deficient in selenium. And again, scientists have found out if you increase the amount of selenium, you produce so many more of these less efficient enzymes that in the end you have the same protective function. So again, based on genetics, you would need more, and a blood test would only tell you, are you in the norm, yes or no? So this is only half the story. This is a little overview of genetics. So I'll explain this to you. This is the GPX1 gene. 67% of Caucasians have the good version. So they have good protection against oxidative stress. 26% have one functional and one broken copy, one less effective copy. So they have lower protection against oxidative stress, and 7% have two of those broken copies, and they need significantly more selenium for the same thing. And down here you see individual studies that that prove this. A little background in the field of medical genetics. So my lab is a medical genetic testing lab. There's a minimum of scientific evidence that you need to make a certain claim, and that is you need at least 3 different scientific studies done by 3 different scientists on 3 different groups of people. And if they all find the same thing, then apparently it's replicable. And then you can say, okay, now this is scientifically valid enough to warrant testing. And then you need to ask yourself the question if it does make sense to know about this information. So, and this is why I said these 52 genes have enough science. So they have at least 3 studies, but as you've seen, some of them have several hundred studies. One of the, I think that's the last example, the HFE gene. This gene controls how much iron we absorb from food. So typically what happens, you eat a diet and it contains a certain amount of iron, but the HFE gene makes sure you only absorb a small amount of it. So you eat a steak and the body decides, okay, let's absorb a little bit of iron, but most of it actually goes through and ends up in the toilet. So this is a very, very stringent regulation because we don't have a way of getting rid of iron, so we just regulate it by how much we absorb. But 1 in 200 people, and 200 Caucasians, has a genetic variation in this gene. So this gene doesn't work correctly. And what happens is the body absorbs way too much iron from food. Now, this is a predisposition to a disease called hemochromatosis, this is iron overload disorder. And contrary to people who are iron deficient, they tend to store more and more iron in the body. So the recommendation for them definitely is to avoid high iron food, and more importantly, do not supplement with iron. So this is actually a case where 1 in 200 people, so pretty much three people in everybody's group of acquaintances that he knows, statistically 2 to 3 people, they should not be supplementing with a standard multi-mineral product because they would actually harm themselves. So this is a very good example of where a genetic test gives you information of what kind of nutrients you should avoid. And this is really something you can only get from genetics with lifestyle. Nobody knows about their tendency to absorb more iron. So this is where you get a lot of information. Final example is the ApoA1 gene. This gene in combination, so if this gene works normally and you combine it with omega-3 fatty acid supplementation, so fish oil capsules, what you would find is that it tends to improve cholesterol. One of the reasons why nutritionists and doctors often recommend to supplement with fish oil or other sources of omega-3 fatty acids to improve cholesterol if they have high cholesterol. So far so good. However, a certain percent of the population, and I'm one of them unfortunately, they have a different version of this gene. And if they then supplement with omega-3 fatty acids, it actually has the opposite effect. So it actually reduces HDL cholesterol, the good cholesterol. So depending on your genetics, you might be helping yourself with a certain supplement, or you might be harming yourself. So what can you do if you're here? It just means do not supplement with extra omega-3, but there are other substances such as phytosterols, which might be a good idea to achieve the same thing. So again, based on your genetics, something might be a good or a bad influence in you. So these were a few examples. As I said, there are 52 genes so far, and there will be more in the future. And it is only a very short overview of the principle of what kind of extra information you can get from a genetic test. So when we look into the market, there are, again, looking at lifestyle genetics and blood levels, the 3 main areas where people do differ. There are some companies, great companies, by the way. I'm in favor of every company that does go into the personalization space. So Care of is a very well-known one, Persona and Sentiments. They all either let you choose what kind of nutrients you want, or they base it on a lifestyle questionnaire. So that's a good approach of trying to personalize it more. And there's a company called Bayes, and they focus on blood levels. So they look for deficiencies, and in those cases, they tend to increase that personalization. Also, I need to say, this is what I found from a quick web search, so please excuse if I might be missing a few details here. There's a company called Vitagene, which actually does a combination of lifestyle and genetics. So looking at both those, and then there's Routine and Vital, I'm not quite sure how to pronounce this, that look at all of these areas. So all companies are going the right direction, and I'm happy that they're doing their job in telling the population that everybody's needs are different, which is definitely true. So different companies, different ways of how people differ. So the next question is, how can you then personalize a supplement? And there are different types of delivery methods, and I just want to talk through all of them to make sure that you know what's important and what to look out for in personalization. So the most straightforward and easiest and probably cheapest way is to use pills. So based on a questionnaire or whatever personalization, you give someone a green pill and a red pill, or just a green pill or a yellow pill, and so on. So essentially you choose which kind of pills to put into a person's mix. That's one approach. Another one is capsules. So in that case, what you would do is you create a unique blend of powders. So you add all of the nutrients that a person needs and mix it together, and then you fill it into capsules. And these are then quite convenient to take. Another solution are liquids. So that's a quite easy solution. You just dissolve the nutrients in your liquid, mix it together, and the person then takes one sip of this every day. Powders is another solution. So again, you blend different powders together, and you have a spoon, and you take your spoon and dissolve it in water. And then there's also something called microbeads, where you would essentially package every nutrient into a certain small pellet, small microbead, and you just mix different amounts of these microbeads together to create the unique mixture. Now let's look at some of the challenges when supplying nutrients. One of the biggest problems in supplement manufacture is that nutrients don't tend to like each other. So essentially, when you mix a vitamin and a mineral together, they react, and usually the vitamin loses, so the mineral breaks down the vitamin. This is a quite tricky thing, because for one thing, you're supplying a supplement that doesn't do what it needs to. Also, what is in there is no longer what is written on the box or on the bottle. So this is a critical problem that you need to avoid. Now, pills are actually quite good solution for this, because you just put vitamins in one pill and minerals in another. So a different selection of pills is a very good way of handling this. Capsules is a little more difficult, because you mix the powders together. So micro vitamins and minerals would be in the same mix in close contact. However, in a dry situation, so essentially they wouldn't react with each other very intensively. It's not optimal, but it's doable. Liquids is definitely a very bad way of handling this, because in the liquid form, in the dissolved form, vitamins and minerals are brilliantly reacting with each other. So this is the best medium for them to interact. So usually when you create liquid vitamins, you really need to restrict yourself to certain nutrients that can actually, that are compatible. So you're restricted there. And they tend to react, and that really reduces the shelf life significantly, if it's even stable there. Powders, again, they're in close contact, but not in liquid, so they react a little bit. And microbeads, again, just like the pills, have the possibility to just keep them in separate microbeads without physical contact, so they can't react. So that's one important aspect. The next one is nutrients can taste really horribly. Certain vitamins are really bad in taste, iron, for example. And again, pills can handle this quite well. You can coat them even in sugar, and you can mask the taste, so that's not an issue. Capsules as well, so the nasty tasting powders are packaged behind a gelatin coating, so you can swallow it, and that's not an issue. Liquids, again, is the worst form, because liquid vitamins, like dissolved vitamins, have a very strong and often unpleasant taste, unless you restrict yourself to the ones that are not tasting too bad. Powders need to be dissolved in liquid before you take them, so same taste problem. And microbeads again can be encapsulated, so what you can also do is cover it in a layer of wax, which masks the taste, so the taste can't actually get out of the microbeads. Then the problem of stability. So obviously you don't want bacteria or fungi or any microorganisms to grow in there and spoil your product. And pills can handle this quite well because you produce them in a sterile environment and it's dry. Essentially, dryness without liquid is a very good way of keeping things sterile and preventing bacteria to grow. Capsules is the same thing. Dry powder in capsules, not an issue. Again, liquids is problematic because a solution with a lot of nutrients in it is the perfect medium for bacteria to grow. So you usually need a preservative or you have a very, very short shelf life. Powders again are dry and microbeads are dry as well. So this is all of these except for liquids are quite good for bacteriology stability. Then there is the problem of uptake inhibition. You might have heard that you shouldn't be taking calcium and zinc at the same time because you should take calcium in the morning and zinc after lunch. The reason is that you usually would take several hundred or thousand milligrams of calcium because that's just the dose that you would need, and only a few milligrams of zinc. Now, calcium and zinc use the same uptake channels from your intestine into the bloodstream. So if you take both of them and you have a lot more calcium, what tends to happen is calcium blocks the uptake of zinc. So you absorb the calcium, but hardly any of the zinc. This is an issue, and this is an issue that pills haven't solved because you have two different types of pills. They go into your stomach, they go to the small intestine, they release the nutrients at the same time at a high dose, usually very quickly, and they tend to interact with each other. Capsules have the same issue because essentially once the gelatin capsule has dissolved, they release the nutrients and you have this inhibition. Liquids as well, there's no way of solving this, and the same for powders. And this is actually where microbeads are probably the best solution. And that is you just put calcium in one microbead and zinc in another one. And what you can do is make sure that they end up in different areas of the intestine. They release very small amounts of the nutrients over a very long time. And this would then make sure that calcium is taken up in one part of the intestine and zinc in another part. So they are physically apart from each other, and you make sure that you have bioavailability for both. So this is something where I think microbeads are the best solution. And then there's a concept of sustained release. This isn't really an issue for most vitamins because we have a way of storing them in our body. But particularly vitamin C is a problem here. If you were to take 80 milligrams of vitamin C and inject it into someone's bloodstream, you would have 80 milligrams in the body. But vitamin C has a half-life of 30 minutes. That means within 30 minutes, your body will have broken down half of it. So you're down to 40. Then with another half an hour, you're down to 20. And so you halve the amount of vitamin C you have in your body. And that means you have an overdose at the beginning. You're in the optimal range for a very short time. And then in the end, you're below the amount that you should be. So one way to get around this is to use a concept of sustained release. So you essentially want to release small amounts over a longer period of time. And that way you try to stay in the optimal range for longer. Now, pills have mastered this. So there are sustained release, slow release pills. There are even some companies which 3D print pills to make sure that this is happening at specific times. So that's a good solution. They can make sure it's slowly released. Capsules haven't mastered this because, again, once the capsule is dissolved, all of the nutrients are released at once. Liquids, another issue. Liquid versions are very bioavailable. So that's appears to be good, but that just means you get all of it into your bloodstream very quickly, and you run into this problem. Powders can't do sustained release, but microbeads can be created so that they release the nutrients over 12 hours. Good. And then finally, the cost of personalization. Obviously, it must be viable. You must be able to afford it. And pills is definitely the easiest solution. So you pre-manufacture pills, and then there are some simple machines which essentially count the different amounts and put them into a bag, and you get your individual pill mix. So that's a very cheap option. Liquids is also quite easy. There are the great robots that can mix different liquids together. Also, what you get is every sip is identical to every other sip or little cup, because it's a very homogeneous mixture. That's very good about liquids, if there weren't all of the other issues. Powders are a little more difficult, because you really need to make sure that you don't mix a powder with very big granules with a powder with small granules, because then you start to get a demixing. And if you have a tub and you have all of the small granules go down to the bottom and the big ones to the top, you, in the worst case, end up with an overdose, because certain nutrients have collected in one area of the tub. So you really need to use certain powders, and also personalization is not so simple. So it's a little more expensive. Microbeads is even more expensive, because every individual ingredient needs to be packaged into these little microbeads, which then need to be coated, and slow release technology and so on. So that certainly is a lot more complicated and a lot more expensive than other options. And the only thing that I think is more expensive is actually packaging personalized powders into capsules, because I'm not aware of a machine that can actually do this without having cross-contamination. So that's the most expensive approach. So looking at all of these, certainly personalization is here to stay. It's something that we see in all sorts of areas. You personalize your car, you personalize your trainers, and so on. And so personalization is here to stay. I'm sure about it, and I'm very happy that there are lots of companies that create awareness of the need of different approaches. And as I've explained, there are good parts and bad parts about every kind of delivery method that can be done. And yes, so essentially, I hope I could give you a short overview of the different aspects of personalization, as well as the role that genes can actually play. And yeah, so if you have any questions, two options, you can write it in the chat, and alternatively, here's the email address, so you can send us emails, and I can make sure that you get the answer to your questions.
Fantastic. Thank you, Dr. Daniel, for that. We have about 10 minutes now if people would like to continue responding and using the Q&A. We've got a question from Gabby here. So Dr. Daniel, can you see those questions?
Let me check. Sorry, I'm new to this. Open question. As a dietitian, from Lauren Schultheis. Is that the one?
There are a couple. So go ahead and read Lauren's and Candace's, and then we've got one from Gabby as well.
So Lauren, as a dietitian, I am constantly educating my clients on why they can't get all of their nutrients from food alone. Do you believe this to be true? If so, what would your main reasons be to why? I think theoretically it could be possible, but then it would be a full-time job. You would be eating fruit and vegetables all day long. You would go out into the sun. So it would be, I think it's possible, but it would take very long or take a lot of energy and time to actually reach this. So typically what I ask people is, did you eat 6 pieces of fruit and vegetable yesterday? And hardly anyone ever says yes. So I think supplements are a good approach to help with this. Actually, there's a story, if we have time, vitamin C is a very interesting story in that respect. Pretty much all mammals produce vitamin C in their cells themselves. So they produce it in every cell constantly. The only mammals that are different are actually apes, so apes and humans. And actually, scientifically, or genetically, this is very interesting, because the gene that produces vitamin C in all mammals is also present in apes and in humans. However, in 100% of apes and humans, there's a genetic mutation in this gene. So this gene is not working anymore. And in 100% of people, so we would have had the gene, but it doesn't produce vitamin C. So they looked at looked for an explanation of why this is happening, and the conclusion they came up with was that before we were apes, we were evolutionary, something like rats, and we produced our own vitamin C. Then we evolved into apes. We went up the tree and we ate fruit all day. And suddenly our diet supplied all of the vitamin C, and we didn't actually need to produce it ourselves anymore. And nature is that way. If you don't need it, you lose it. And there was no disadvantage. The first ape that had a mutation in this gene didn't have a disadvantage over others because they all had sufficient amounts of vitamin C in their diet. And then eventually the gene was completely broken in the whole species. And then we came down from the tree and went into the savannah, and suddenly we changed our diet, and not in such a way that we have enough vitamin C. So we're really running into that issue now, that we are not getting that from our diet. And that's actually also thought to be one of the reasons why our half-life for vitamin C is so short. We never evolutionarily needed a way to store it because we produced it all the time. And that is gone now. So either you make sure you eat vitamin C like an ape throughout the whole day and make sure you get it. That could be sufficient. Or there's another way of using slow release supplements. So I hope this answered your question. It was a little off track, but yeah, so this is my reply. Do I know of any training courses in nutrigenomics? Well, I do create some nutrigenomics courses or webinar kind of things. So there is something that I can share. It's not going a lot deeper than the kind of thing that I just showed you. So a few more examples maybe, but I also have to say I'm in Austria now, I'm in Europe, so I don't really know much about the education system in the US in this field. So I'm afraid I don't have a very good answer for this at the moment. Fascinating, Lauren, fascinating, thank you. Thank you very much. Then okay, is this recorded so I can listen? And I think somebody replied, yes, it is.
And then Dr. Daniel, in the chat, we got a couple of additional questions. So one from Gabby, I'll read now, is my question is, how do the personalized supplements get regulated if the dosages and mixture are different for each individual?
Yeah, so from the FDA point of view, it's just important that whatever is inside is also written on the box. There is some variation that is allowed, so you can be a few percent off, a few percent more or less. But it's important if you create a product that if it says 100 milligrams of vitamin C, that you have very close to 100 milligrams in there. This is a requirement. So the FDA will check products randomly, and also when there's a complaint. And then they will check, is there that amount in there? And if the technology is good enough to actually achieve this, then it will be okay. So from a regulatory point of view, if you have your technology under control, then this is usually not an issue.
We have a question. Do you have to do the genetics test in order to get the routine vitamins?
No. Basically, we can do it on the basis of different sources. So the easiest, fastest one is just to fill out a lifestyle assessment. That's actually on the website. It's free to do. Also, if you don't want to order, you can just do it and find out what the recommendations would be. So that's the first one. This could be enough, and you can say, okay, I just want it based on my lifestyle. Then there's the possibility to upload your own blood data. We're also developing our own blood test, but if you have gone to a blood lab and you know you're deficient in something, you just enter it, and that then filters into the algorithm and increases whatever you're deficient in. And then from a genetic testing point of view, you don't need to do it. It's beneficial to know. And there are two ways. Either you send the sample to us and we do the analysis, or if you have your own 23andMe data or Ancestry.com data, we can also use that. So lots of different sources. The more information you give us, the more we can actually put into the personalization.
We had a response from one of our panelists saying that SNPed, S-N-P-E-D, and Opus 23 do nutrigenomics education as well. My intuition is that there are several bodies in the States that will do this. Y'all probably know that a lot more than me. So if you are listening to this webinar, to the recording, and you have a good recommendation for us, we'd love to share that and spread the word.
Great.
Fantastic. So then
I got another one, pricing for genetics and blood tests through your company. On Routine, I think it's $60 per month, and it's a 3-month minimum. So essentially what you would do is you sign up, you do the questionnaire. It costs $60, you pay per month, and you will get the DNA sample set, you send it back. We do the analysis, and then the supplements are being sent. And it's always a bunch of a box of 3 months worth of supplements, and that is then paid every 3 months. And if you don't like it, you can cancel after these 3 months. So yeah, it's around $60 a month.
Fantastic. And Healthie and Routine are looking to partner and help our members out if this is something that does interest you. We'll be formalizing some next steps and some good practices as well, if it's something that you'd want to do in your business. So what we're going to do from here on out is, first off, we are thankful for you for joining today, and I hope that this was informative and educational. I personally, this is Erica, I think the industry is emerging, going to only become bigger and bigger in the coming years, and there's so much that is at stake, because it really can change the way that our clients can consume food, supplements, and get the nutrients that they need to actually live their best lives. And we should use informed data to really help make those decisions as much as possible as the technology continues to get stronger and stronger and stronger. So what we'll do is we're sending out a survey as well, the Google Doc link that I had, and I put in the chat right now. If you haven't filled it out, many of you already have. Please make sure to pop in for a couple of minutes and add your thoughts, reactions to this webinar, and any other questions that you have. We are here to help. And then, of course, reach out hello@routinevitamins.com, which is the email that you see right now, if you have any questions too. So thank you to Dr. Daniel for a fantastic presentation today, as well as to the team here. And we really hope that you enjoyed this presentation.
Okay, thank you very much. I enjoyed it, and I appreciated the possibility to share something that is so interesting to me to other people who are also interested. So thank you very much for the opportunity, and yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great rest of your day.